All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I think we can begin. Welcome to this transformation hosted noon meeting. So we've got four colleagues in person in the room, and we've got quite a number online as well. Hope you can see us. The video will be pointed towards them in a while. And the theme of today is speaking about, or in fact, continuing the discussion that we had in the last meeting. And the first, if you remember, we had a session on decolonizing global health in Africa, and Dr. Samuel Otti came and shared very pragmatic approaches and cases, and gave us, quite a lot of food for thought at that time. So based on the feedback that we had at the last meeting, we thought, let's continue along the same breath. And we have invited colleagues from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to share some of their own experiences on decoloniality and anti-racism in global health. And they had a very interesting approach in developing a student toolkit at their school. And we thought it would be quite interesting for us to have a sense of how they came about developing the tool, how has the tool been received, and what are some of the learnings for us as a school, as a university, and more importantly, as a transformation committee as well. So the first speaker will be Emilie Besson, and she is a health economist and scholar activist working to advance gender equity and anti-racism in health science, promote ethical and decolonial research practices, and bridge the gap between researchers, policymakers, and communities, especially in Africa. She has an MSc in public health, specializing in health economics. Second will be Clarke, and she completed her MSc in nutrition for global health at LSHTM. She is an advisor and coordinator of the fight against institutional racism, so FAIR network, at LSHTM, and health improvement and disparities researcher in the Department of Health and Social Care, and is also postgraduate student in culture, diaspora, ethnicity at Beck University of London. So she is committed to rooting her work in disrupting legacies of coloniality in service of social justice. And then finally, we will have Ruth Ponsford. She's an assistant professor in school health intervention and research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And her research is primarily UK-based and focuses on adolescent health, particularly sexual health and interpersonal violence. And she is also a steering committee member of the Fight Against Institutional Racism, or FAIR network, at LSHTM. So we welcome Ruth, Emilie, and Amber, and many of her colleagues who are part of FAIR as well. Sarah, I see her, she's online as well, and others who may join. And I will then hand over to Emilie to begin the presentation. So Emilie, it is an hour noon meeting. So at about 12:40, I'll just let you know. I'll just signal to you.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So my name is Emilie. So the first thing I'm going to do, there's a echo. I think, yeah, thank you. So the one thing, what I'm going to talk about is really the history of our movement at the school. So it started in June last year in the midst of the George Floyd situation. I posted a letter online and I said, we need to hold LSHTM accountable for its silence in the midst of like the George Floyd murder. It wasn't my letter. It's something that I found online that was written by activists in the US and other part of the world. And they were saying, if your institution is silent, take that letter, just send it as a template. So I took the letter, put it online, didn't really tell anyone. And somehow in 5 days, it gathered more than, I think, 600, 700 signatures. But what was interesting is also people started to share their stories. And so we started having testimonies of former students, like current students, alumni, staff, past staff. We had people who studied at the SPH in 2002 who just like took upon themselves to share their experiences. And what they were talking about was really like a history of like colonial teaching, racism that they were victim of, when people were talking about the teaching that they were receiving and how they felt alienated by what was said, and thinking, I didn't know that's how they talked about us. And they point also like different directly certain people, and we anonymized it. But after 5 days, I took the entire letter with the testimonies and I shared it with the senior leadership at the school, meaning the director and all those people. It had quite an impact because it led to the school putting a statement internally and externally, and then the council, which is the board of the school, to invite us to discuss like racism at the school. In that moment, we really made a very intentional decision to not talk about those examples. We said we wanted to educate the school on why the school was institutionally racist and those colonial legacies were still very, very, very much present at the school. We talked about a culture of racism, a culture of coloniality, and how those could be addressed. One of our recommendations in that moment was we need to commission an external evaluation on the state of racism at the school. And it took a lot of advocacy, and it wasn't just us, it was really everyone. But that evaluation was run, and actually the report is right now has been made publicly available on the website. What I want to say is when we posted this out and those testimony came about, it was kind of electroshock for a lot of people. And we had different reactions. Some people were saying, oh, it's only few people, so it's not really representative of the school. Some other were pretty shocked and they thought, oh my God, like what has been happening and how did we not know that? One of the comments of a board member was, why we didn't know that, basically. But then there were also the people who felt like we've been talking about this for a long time. So this is about time, and how is it that it took this global pandemic and it took that letter and it took all of this for people to actually start recognizing that racism was entrenched in our organization. So with that in mind, different departments at the school started reaching out to us and asking to better understand, because what was very apparent was a knowledge gap. People didn't understand what racism was. They didn't understand that what they were doing was even racist. They didn't understand what colonial legacy were. And so we started having meetings with, I think, almost all the department at the school, and it was really like single request. And I really want to emphasize on the fact that it wasn't just the teaching department. We had a meeting actually with the finance department, with the HR department, because they started also to reflect on the practices that enable those situations. Some of them being the fact that everything in organization is in English. So I remember, for example, I did a project on Yemen, and our colleagues in Yemen mostly speak Arabic. And so when you send them a contract in English, what are you expecting? It just meant that us, as part of the project, had to translate everything and just send it to them and explain it to them, because it's already also different ways of working and doing things. We had issues around payment mechanism because we only pay people through their bank account. So if you're in a country where the bank system is a bit different, or even you have very high charges, which is very, very common in like Africa or even in the Middle East in certain countries, then a lot of people who we work with and the frontline worker, they don't own a bank account. So we had to do that advocacy also and say, can we start paying people in the Western Union? Because that's how they get actually the money. And we need to be able to work with people in country. So again, it was quite an important realization, because we are a school which is being advertised as being very international, but international and only working in English and only having policies that are designed around like how the UK is doing things is actually directly impacting the work that we do. And it is racist and colonial by nature. One of the things that we realized as well was in terms of like fundings and how we identify local partners. All those policies has been discussed now, and I'm not going to say that there's been a change, but it is something that people now better understand as being problematic and as systematically discriminating against the people we're trying to work with. So really what we're doing, we didn't have the support of the school leadership. Let's be honest with that. We kind of imposed ourselves. And what we did is initially, we always said we would not be part of the school. We wanted our organization to be external because it offered us a certain level of protection. We knew that the work that we're doing was not being managed by anyone at the school. We created an external website where we would send and post our letters. We had an external email as well, just because it allowed people to have a sense of security. They would share things with us knowing that it was not in the LSHM system, basically. It was outside people who were doing that. So everything really took a turn when one person at the school reached out and talking about a situation that was quite shocking. It was a student, and the student had been engaging with the school for many years, many months, actually 16 months, about one of the professor having really racist language during the school, during the lectures. It was quite abstract to us because the student kept saying, oh, that professor was turning off the recording and saying, like, just to give you an example, that person said that, oh, you know, African, they're just savages in like grassroots skirts. You need to assert your authority. They don't know what to do anything, and all the things. And you need to understand that in the UK, it is mandatory by law for every lecture to be recorded. So when someone comes to us and say the recording was off, it doesn't make any sense, because when you enter a theater, there is that little sign and it turned red and it says recording on. So even me, I didn't even know where the machine room was. And then she mentioned that, and we realized that on the testimony, there was one testimony from that exact master program with 41 students co-signing on those exact same words. We were in a room, the person was turning off the recording, the person was saying all those like racial slurs. What happened? So when we started investigating a bit more, we talked to the students and we're being given like even more evidence that the issue was being brought up to every level of the administration. Nothing was being done. And considering that most students at the school do a master in 1 year, it's kind of convenient because something happened, you kind of let it go, the student goes away, the issue goes away. That's it. So we wrote a letter, and we written a lot of letters, and directly actually send it to the entire council, the entire leadership, and the person that was being mentioned in the situation. Let me tell you that the first reaction was the person threatened to sue us for defamation, but we knew we knew we were right. And we didn't just send that letter to the school administration and leadership, we made that letter public. And we anonymized everything. We used gender neutral pronouns. We didn't put any dates to it or anything. Within 5 minutes of posting that letter, we started having students emailing us and saying, I was in the room, I know exactly what you're talking about, I want to do something about it. And they kept coming and they kept coming. So we shared that with the school leadership, and it led to the school deciding to hire an external company to do an internal investigation of the situation. They interviewed students, they did different things, and it's not just because of that, but it led to actually that person being like, a contract being ended at the school. And one of the recommendations from the external investigation was to work with us. The external investigator identified and said, from the conversation with the student, they do not trust the administration to do something about this. They have been sharing the situation many times. They trust FAIR to do that. So you need to work with them in order to better understand those students. So when the school reached out to us with those findings, and there was also an announcement made at the entire school, they apologized, they recognized the notion. It was the first time actually that they recognized in the word that the school is institutionally racist, and there's been a lot of like institutional failure to protect the students. And they informed also everyone that they would be working with us. So that's how the institutionalization started. And I'm going to let Amber talk about this a bit more.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers of this talk for inviting us. It's genuinely a real pleasure to be here and talk to you today. So yeah, thank you, Emilie, for that background. I guess I'm going to speak a little bit about our ways of working since that point when the school kind of approached us and said, okay, we recognise now that we really need to work with your group. And then I'll speak a little bit about the toolkit and just how that came into fruition. So in terms of the fair ways of working, from that point, we recognised with the school that we needed to become more internalised, so a more formal structure, in order that our work could be more formally and thoroughly embedded into the fabric of the institution. So we agreed with the school that we would formalise in that way, but we were also very conscious that we couldn't and would not let ourselves become just another maybe mouthpiece of the institution itself. And so our autonomy, which was always the thing that we had held on to and that was so strong about our group, our autonomy over what we produced and what we said, we were absolutely sure that that needed to remain intact. So we worked with the senior leadership team on a ways of working agreement, and some key points within that were, first and foremost, the full autonomy over what we produced was written into that agreement, but also that, you know, our work would need to be recognized and compensated. And, you know, what many institutions find is that EDI work is thought of by the kind of more senior levels as what we call office housekeeping. And it's often left to Black and brown people to actually do that work. It's not recognized properly and it's not compensated. So part of our ways of working agreement was that there would be a salary kind of rubric whereby anyone who worked with us and with the Fair Network and on these projects would be properly compensated. Which was agreed and was great. And some other key points within that document and that agreement were that we would not be turned into a network that had membership. I know that was a point that Emilie brought up and we all agreed was really key, because again, this work can become something that people feel they want to kind of sign up to and almost have as part of their signature, as it were. But we regard this as work that you cannot sign up to. It's not an interest group. It's something that has to be part of our work as practitioners of, you know, global health or related industries. So we were very keen that it was not something that people could sign up to per se, and that it should be work that the entire institution and everyone related to the institution would take part in. And then one of the final points, again, that we felt was important was that we wrote in that document that we did not want to exist indefinitely. And so our aim is always to work with people to embed this learning and understanding and critical analysis into the work of LSHTM and projects and groups that work with the institution, so that eventually it will be embedded and we will have undergone a transformation as an institution that will render FAIR unnecessary as an entity. So that's kind of a little bit about what we agreed with the institution. And then moving on to the toolkit. The toolkit was our first project within this way of working with the school as the FAIR Network. And we chose to begin with the toolkit because we felt a sense of urgency there. We knew that from, you know, working in the institution for, it had been about 18 months at that time, that students knew that what they were learning was deficient, but they didn't know where to go for information or what information was sort of hidden from them. And we felt that we really needed to provide a document that students could go to when they were writing assignments, undertaking projects, having conversations, or if an issue came up, that would be a real resource that was very specific to their experience at LSHTM. So we decided to write this student-focused toolkit. But of course, the toolkit contains, almost all of the information in it is applicable and extrapolatable to a much wider audience. So how we went about that was Emilie conceived of the 3 main sections of the toolkit. So history and context, anti-racism and me, and racism and we. And then we sat down and spoke through kind of our understanding of the history and the theory and the practice that we felt students really needed in order to make sense of the education that they were receiving at LSHTM. And we kind of plotted that theory and those practical elements into the main sections. And that's how we kind of came up with the outline. And in terms of who was actually going to write the toolkit, we wanted to work directly with students and alumni because, of course, with this being a focused toolkit, we wanted to have those opinions, perspectives, and experiences feed into it. So we put out a call for evidence. A call for expressions of interest for students or alumni to come forward and want to write sections of this toolkit. And we eventually hired 3 alumni who, some of who are on the call today, who came from very different backgrounds and had very different experiences and perspectives. But that worked really well because what that enabled us to do was bring those perspectives directly into the toolkit. So you will see as you look through the toolkit that there's a lot of kind of theory and then it goes into more practical elements. And then what we have is how it manifests between us at LSHTM. And that, was really useful to have all of those different perspectives feed in. So the writing of the toolkit was a really nice experience, I think, for all of us. And then go ahead.
No, I wanted to add just something about this is the reason also why it started, because I didn't mention it before, but our first toolkit, we wrote it in 2020. After meeting all the departments, people keep asking us, what should we do? How should we do this? And blah, blah. And to be honest, we wanted to provide something. It was also like, it would be easier to have one document rather than like having to repeat the same thing over and over again. And so we started with the idea of let's have a 10-question situation, and then it turned into a full-on toolkit, which is massive, but there was a lot of knowledge into it. And actually that toolkit has been shared within the entire school. And people kept saying, oh, you need to look at this. And the deans were sharing within the department was sharing it, but it was a full BLM LSHTM toolkit. It was never a request from the school. It is an initiative that we took upon ourselves and like we created. And we're really happy that it was so like well received and all things. But then when it came to the institutionalization, we went for the student as well, because we are a school, and although most of our funding don't come from students, it is still very important. So when you have a situation where a lot of students are complaining about the content of their curriculum and all things, it kind of created an incentive for the leadership to say, okay, we need actually to invest money in this because those are the people who bring money also within the school. I think we also wanted to make sure that we can link the theory to the practice, which is why in the toolkit, there's a lot of example, and we added a section about how does it manifest between you and I. We also included the question that we included were very much from the question we have received. We wanted to make sure to include them. And then, like Amber said, we had the diversity of speakers and not speakers, but people worked on the toolkit, and we made it clear in the toolkit that this toolkit is not prescriptive. It reflects the experience of the people who wrote it. If we had a different team, it could have been a completely different toolkit. But we wanted to explain also and make it clear to people that, like, yeah, we have different experiences and positionality within the school, And the reason also why we decided to take the people from the school is because that has been a very strong argument of us with the leadership, is that all the knowledge is within the school. All those issues that we've had, someone at the school at any point in time, I've talked about it to someone or I've experienced it. And so we wanted to highlight that by really having that structure that works within the school, with the knowledge that we have in all things. And rather than always wanting to kind of hire some external person who has no experience, who doesn't understand also how the schools work, because we're not a university like UCL or even yours. We're very much we're like an institute. And so it's very different in type of functioning, in type of organizational practice and all the things. And that's really one of the things that we had in mind when we created the toolkit. And back to you.
Yes, no, thank you for that addition. I will just finish up with very briefly touching on kind of where we are now and what has kind of spun off this movement before I let Ruth go into more detail about kind of how it's been embedded. So, I mean, I'll leave most of this info depending on the questions that people maybe have at the end, because we could speak for hours, I think, about different sections of this work and different difficulties we've experienced and etc. But what it looks like at the institution now is there are different bodies and groups that are doing different work in this realm at the institution. So you have the institutional level, whereby, as Emilie mentioned, there was an external review that was published, and then many recommendations that came from that the school are legally obliged to uptake. And so there's been this huge anti-racism action plan that's been designed, and from that there are all these different tributaries, so all of these different groups that are tasked with carrying out and bringing this work to completion in terms of the conclusions and recommendations from the review. So it's a very, very big school-wide project ongoing, and we could have a whole conversation around how much of that is maybe risks paying lip service to the real issues and how much is kind of very genuine. That's another conversation, but that's kind of at the school level. And then lots of groups have kind of arisen within the school. Well, more so than groups, different groups are doing pieces of work. So we have student groups who might, be putting on a talk, or, infinite numbers of talks and presentations and discussions and things. So it certainly is a conversation that's being had at the school that does come from really Emilie's initial letter and everything that's happened that we've described in the 2 years since. But I'm happy to kind of take questions on that, and I'll pass over to Ruth. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Amber. So my understanding that part of the reason that I'm here as well is also to try and give you some examples of some practical application of the toolkit. Is kind of what I understood that you were interested in. So I've got some slides because I'm a stuffy academic and I can't talk without slides. So I'm just gonna share those if I can. Okay, that's taking a minute. Can you see those? Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, I guess kind of what Amber and Emilie have already spoken about and alluded to is the kind of idea that the BLM letter that Emilie initially started and the work that's followed with FAIR has really galvanised a lot of the work around decolonisation and anti-racism at the school. So while there was some organisations already present at the school, so we had, for example, the Decolonising Global Health Group, and there had been a number of discussions, of various different areas and parts of the institution about the presence of racism and colonial legacies and those kinds of things. The letter and the work from Emilie and the rest of the FAIR group really sort of galvanised work towards decolonisation and anti-racism, and really was what was driving that work forward. And I think importantly about the toolkit really provides us with some tools to think and ways to reflect on the work that we're doing, our research, and also our teaching at LSHTM. But what I was going to talk to you a little bit about today is some of the kind of things that myself and some colleagues have been working with in terms of how we've been thinking about decolonising our own modules and our own teaching and learning at LSHTM. So as for those of you who are already sort of familiar with the literature in this field, when we're kind of talking about decolonisation, we are talking about those broader concrete shifts in power. So we might be talking about those epistemic, political, financial shifts that we might in fact often consider to be beyond the scope of what we're actually doing in our teaching and learning. And one of the things that I found quite useful, which was also something that I picked up from the toolkit, is the kind of language of beyond decolonising that Sharon Appleton puts forward. So these are kind of the ideas which represent more realistically what we're actually doing in terms of when we're thinking about decolonising our materials or moving beyond that language. So in this case, it's useful to think about the ways in which we're diversifying our syllabus, curriculum, infrastructure and staff. We're digressing from the canons, digressing from the norms, decentering knowledge and knowledge production away from the global north, and devaluing hierarchies and in many respects reevaluating or revaluing relationality as well, and thinking about the ways in which some voices may be diminished in our work and our teaching and learning, the kind of opinions and perspectives that have predominated, the dominant paradigms through which we understand our methodologies and our research, and also thinking about the ways in which we magnify those voices that have been unheard. So those, I think, initially were really useful concepts and tools to start for us to start thinking about the work of decolonisation. And I'm not going to make any grand claims at all about the idea that we've decolonised our modules. So this work is very much ongoing. You know, we don't sort of have this idea that we're going to come to a point where we can turn around and say, right, we've ticked all the boxes, we've done it, we've decolonised our materials. So we just want to sort of touch really on a couple of ways in which we've been approaching these activities in our modules that might be considered ways in or starting points, and useful ways that we've found of approaching this in our institution. And it doesn't by any means also represent all the other work that's going on at the school. There are a number of other people who lead modules, who are again engaged in this work and doing other work around the school around this. So I was just going to draw on some examples from. Hang on, I can't see my slides very well there. Some examples from the modules that I am engaged with working on at LSHTM. So one of those is the Principles of Social Research module, and I work on that with Ford Hickson, and I have done since 2020. And this is a 10-week module. It's a term 1 module, and it's a very introductory module. So our students' cohorts are very diverse. Some of them will come with some experiences of social research, but the majority of them will come from medical backgrounds and have very limited experience of social research. The course is structured around a number of mini research activities that students take part in. They complete as preparatory work before they come to their lectures and seminars. There's also a lecture every week and a seminar every week. The course, each year we have about 300 students on this course, so it's a pretty big course, around 20 to 25 seminar leaders, and it's also a compulsory module for a number of the courses at LSHTM. So it's a compulsory module for MSc Public Health for Development, Reproductive and Sexual Health Research, and Demography and Development in health as well. There's also lots of different contributors on the module. So we have lectures that are often not delivered by myself or the other lead, Ford, and that creates its own challenges in terms of how we manage and control the content of those lectures. I guess we could consider it, or we might consider it, quite a high stakes module, because it is a compulsory module for so many courses, and it's also quite a large module where we have a number of very senior professors at the institution presenting and giving lectures on this course. The other course I was going to refer to is the sexual health module, which is directed by Mitzi Gaffos, Pippa Grenfell and Anique Sorahando. They couldn't be here today, although they would have loved to be. So they've just sort of shared some of their experience with us as well to talk about today. So that's quite a small elective module. It's a term 2 module. It's a 5-week intensive course. Probably has about 50 students on it, and again runs it includes lectures, seminars, and a number of different panels as well, and again involves quite a lot of contributors, different contributors. So that's not necessarily the module organisers, again, which has implications for the control of content there. And so I was just really going to focus again around some of the key ideas that came out of the initial BLM letter and the testimonies that were connected to that letter. So some of the key issues that were raised and brought to the fore in that letter were around the lack of diversity in the teaching body. So this clearly has implications for student belonging, whether students see themselves as reflected in the teaching body, but also in terms of who we present or who is held up as the producers of knowledge, if you like, or as credible knowers, including about the global south, where a significant proportion of our students come from and work, and so also affecting the frame through which teaching is curated as well. And the second big theme that came through again from the BLM letter and the initial testimonies was around the idea of the knowledge and experience of Black and other students of colour and students from the global south, that knowledge being devalued in the classroom. So this kind of idea that their experience is not valued, it's not relevant, it's not recognised as credible, they're not credible knowers by both teaching staff and peers, despite often having immense relevant local and professional experience in terms of the kind of topics that are being discussed in class. And then obviously the third issue is around lack of diversity of teaching materials, which links to also the lack of diversity in the teaching body. So this is kind of the idea around that many of the examples that are provided in the materials exclude research and examples from the global south. Also, focuses very much on Western ways of knowing, those Western research paradigms, and using that Western or colonial lens through which we understand others or populations in the global south. And yes, and so I was just going to make a comment really sort of on the ways in which these things students express being alienated. So what was being taught didn't resonate with their own experience or knowledge, and what they knew to be true, and often representing inaccurate and pejorative representations of their countries, cultures, health systems and practices. So I'm just going to move on. With that slide there. Yes, so in terms of diversifying the teaching body then, so to think about those three themes, in many respects that is a challenge that lies with more senior managers and the need for hiring faculty that can diversify perspectives in teaching and research. But one way in which that has been quite successfully approached is in the sexual health module, whereby they have both implicitly and more recently explicitly sought to bring in guest lecturers who are from the global south or who are Black and other people of colour as well. So, and being a sexual health module, they have also sought to include also speakers from diverse sexual and gender identities and speakers with disabilities and activists and advocates for sex worker rights and so on as well. And the module has had really good success with that approach, and student feedback has been very, very positive in terms of the diversity and kind of critical perspectives that have been presented on the module. But we were talking yesterday in our discussions with the module leaders about how this is very much a temporary solution. So while it enriches the student experience and learning, it doesn't address those issues kind of more permanently at the institutional level. So it doesn't change the fabric in the institution, if you like. And there's something almost a little bit perverse or tokenistic about borrowing from these contributors to enhance the teaching and obviously the reputation of our institution, but then they're still not, you know, employed or, you know, brought into the institution, if you like, and it doesn't reflect any larger structural changes at the institutional level. So that's not a critique of the module organisers at all, but it's just, I guess, one of the examples in the way in which we think about decolonising, and the way in which this work that we're doing doesn't decolonise, because it doesn't address those broader structures of change, if you like, which largely remain intact. And just thinking about the principles of social research module, to date we found it much harder to bring in external lecturers, because there exists quite a bit of tension between the idea that students are coming to our institution to hear from our eminent, largely white European professors, you know, as the experts in the field. And principles of social research as a first module, first term module, has always kind of been the module that kind of showcases, I guess, the expertise at the school and their methodological approaches. But of course, you know, given the makeup of the staff, and not disrupting that or changing that, we do continue to, you know, kind of reproduce that white academic field, if you like, or the coloniality of knowledge. So the way in which we're presenting these white Western academics and their systems and ways of knowing as those that are credible and are worth learning about. You know, these are the people that you should be learning from, and, you know, we're going to teach you about. So we certainly also perceive some challenges in removing those more established lectures. They're very senior professors on the course, and certainly a sense personally that we need to take it quite slow, because it was such quite a high stakes module, and we want to be able to get those things right. You know, there's also a risk of making things become tokenistic, and actually it requires quite a bit of work to seek out, you know, the right people to be able to give lectures on the topics that you're interested in including in your modules, and they're maybe not people that we necessarily, you know, we often know the work of the people that we work with, or the people who work in our field. So, you know, some of this work requires the time and energy to be seeking out additional, you know, contributors to the module. So at the moment, for example, I'm quite interested in finding someone who might be able to give a lecture on participatory and Indigenous methods, and something on ethics and social research with a focus on situated ethics and research in the global south. So if anyone in the group has got any suggestions about that, I'd be very interested to hear. You can email them or pass them on afterwards. But also the particular challenges in our system in terms of bringing in external lectures are around payment, which is frankly pretty poor, and also the HR requirements. And there's been a lot of concerns and complaints about the kind of hostile environment that guest lecturers experience from HR. So with the level of checks, right to work, showing ID, having to have like notarized copies of passports to prove their identity, and all this burden of paperwork, which you know, present challenges and, you know, a level of obvious discrimination to external lecturers that we're attempting to bring in. So just to return to PSR and kind of the approach that we took. Sorry.
34 minutes left.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Are you
wanting to?
I'm saying, are you able to perhaps wrap up in 34 minutes? Then we can take questions.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, yeah, I want to ensure that I do leave some space. So I won't actually be able to cover everything that I've included today, but I'll just continue on to this point, maybe particularly in terms of the guests, the lecture section, I guess, and the diversity of the teaching body. So in principles of social research, as I said, we found it much harder to draw in external lectures, and the kind of approach that we took was very much more around sort of making visible or shining a light on the fact that all the lecturers were white British, for example, and that is how their teaching and learning was framed, or the material was framed. So in our first lecture, for example, my colleague Ford, who takes that first lecture, he dubs the course the principles of white British research, for example. And with this aim, we're trying to create a space for that critical discussion, I guess, around you know, encouraging that critical perspective around whose voices and whose approaches to research are being privileged, whose voices are being excluded, and the kind of like asymmetries of power in spaces of knowledge production and how those have been shaped by colonial histories. And that's been quite an important learning point for me, I think, just around the idea that, you know, it's, of course, diversifying our curriculum materials is incredibly important. It's something that we have to do a lot more work on, particularly with our courses, but just that also the importance of, or the value, you know, also alongside that, of creating this critical perspective that enables students to interrogate the knowledge that is being set before them and the kind of knowledge hierarchies that become apparent. I know we want to finish up fairly quickly. So what we do in PSR is we do provide, you know, essential readings pointing to the different ways that knowledge might be valued. We encourage students to think a lot about positionality and pose, so the way in which individuals shape their research and the way in which that is produced. And those things are also foregrounded in preparatory activities where students are asked in the first week, for example, to carry out observations in public, where they are then getting that experiential learning about different ways of looking, understanding how they look and how that might be shaped by their positionality as well. There are other examples that we could talk about. I was going to talk about particularly the ways in which we set up the understanding of our seminars. So in seminars, again, we're very much addressing this idea that student knowledge was not valued in the classroom. So we're very clear to both students and our teaching staff that we emphasise that, you know, the importance of developing a space for critical reflection and also the co-production of knowledge, so understanding between students and seminar leaders, and that everybody in the room has valuable knowledge to contribute. And we do actually also ask seminar leaders to set ground rules, which is another useful thing that we found. So setting ground rules in terms of the interaction in the classroom and how students should go about that. So there's just an example of that there as well.
Ruth, I think we only have 10 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna finish there, but perhaps we can leave. Yeah, we'll leave stuff to questions afterwards.
Maybe also share the slides afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think there's a question already in the chat. Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Emilie.
Thank you so much, Emilie, Amber, and Ruth. And I think the slides can be shared with everyone. I thought let's give time for engagement and questions. And the first is it's actually a comment from Feroza. Do you want to speak to it, Feroza, or do you prefer I read?
If I may speak, it might help because typing probably doesn't translate well. So you know, we've grappled a lot with concepts of whose knowledge, what knowledge is valued, etc. And so while those debates are really very interesting, when it comes to actually structuring the curriculum, we find that we slip into old habits of using the best available evidence. And so I'm just wondering, I would really love to hear from the panel and people in the meeting, how do they make that work within the curriculum?
Thanks, Feroza. I'll hand that over to Ruth or Amber.
Yeah.
Emilie?
Ruth, you want to answer or?
Yeah, I guess we're still doing work around this ourselves. So I wouldn't suggest by any means that this is resolved for us. But I guess a lot of the work we do is
the mic. Yeah, thank you.
Is thinking about how we reassess hierarchies of knowledge and what we understand to be as valuable knowledge, but also thinking about pluralistic ways of doing research, I guess, so that we can draw on a number of different research paradigms to provide better evidence, if you like. So it may well be that this is, it's still an evidential way of thinking, but it's about how we are thinking about providing better evidence to answer our questions, I think, by taking that more pluralistic approach. I mean, the question is a lot of the evidence we have doesn't accurately reflect the populations or the problems that we are interested in. I guess it's about expanding the scope of the perspective and the contribution so that we can ultimately produce better evidence, better solutions to our problems.
I think also like one thing that I've been doing a lot is just like expanding my research. I think we're very complacent when it comes to our use of references and literature. Because like you said, it's like those, even the module that we have at the school, they just like the same thing the same year. And we tend to use, and because, yeah, it's a white British institution and it's like, oh, people come to see about our expertise, then the idea becomes that the literature that we share with students is also literature written by people at LSHTM. And so that's the issue. It's like they don't even realize that they are being taught in a bubble. And so one of the recommendations that we've given a lot of students and also the teaching body was to look beyond. One of the things that I do even in my own work is if I'm writing about Yemen, I'm literally using PubMed to look for Yemeni researcher. And you can do that by affiliation and all the things, but it's just function that we don't even think about using because we just assume that, oh no, it's the same everywhere, but no. And one thing that it does is like when you write a paper or even you do a seminar, this is what people are going to use in the future. So when I'm citing Yemeni authors on a Yemeni article, I'm expecting people who read the article to read about the work of that person as well. And so I think changing the curriculum is also just like you need to be very intentional about who you mention, who you cite, who you reference, and it's about egos. And yeah, in module like PSR, it's pretty massive, and it's the mandatory modules. So it's not that easy to take away from those very senior professors at the school. But yeah.
Could I quickly add my own take on that as well? Because I think those are really interesting perspectives and probably more practical than mine because I'm more in the theory side of things. But I think what can also be useful is because of the way most of us have been taught, we, again, I think like Emilie alluded to, have quite a narrow or have learned in quite a narrow way of, yeah, where to find knowledge and what is applicable to what we're trying to understand. But my work now, I see more as bringing critical theories into conversation with the work that we do as global health practitioners. And that's been really interesting because where we may not find those critiques in the kind of journals or publications that we're used to looking to, there is such a wealth of kind of information that we can find if we look to other disciplines. So, I mean, just to pull on a quick example, we may not find who we want to be looking to speaking specifically about something and providing us with evidence around, for example, universal health coverage. But there is a very full body of work in critical social sciences that speaks about, you know, the concept itself of universal health coverage and how that feeds into a more neoliberal kind of framework, etc. So if we broaden which disciplines we're going to, that for me very much speaks to a delinking from that kind of colonial matrix that we're bound in so much of the time.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would just add that thing is I've been like reviewing like articles a lot on like anti-racism and decoloniality. And I remember one in particular. It was funny because they did a systematic review on the knowledge on decolonizing global health. And it was so like I was remember looking at it and thinking, but we just started, it became mainstream in 2020, but like decoloniality is not new. It's always been there. And I didn't understand why they thought that they would find that knowledge within the public health or global health literature, because it's not specific to public health or global health. And so it's really about expanding where we find the knowledge. And I agree, critical science, critical, like all things, there is all that knowledge. And so even when we think about decolonizing, if you only read what's been published in the past 2 years, you're missing out on a lot. Because there's so much out there, and especially so much written in the continent and like for years, but it is absolutely not in the public health space.
Thanks so much to everyone. I think we still have maybe 2-3 minutes for one more question. So I'll take one from the audience. The comments, input. Nothing. So from my side, my interest is how have the students received the revised curriculum, and have you evaluated in terms of their thoughts about the improvements that have been made?
You're muted.
So interestingly, this is actually a London School initiative as opposed to one that we've sort of implemented ourselves, but they have every module has a online feedback form, and they did 2 years ago now, but our module has only had it for 1 year. They did actually include a question about the extent to which students felt the module was inclusive and had, you know, taken a decolonial lens. I forget the exact wording now, but that has certainly been very, very useful, and in getting student feedback. Students have been very active in feeding back, and has also provides really great evidence actually. So when I'm talking about the kind of lectures that we have on our course, provides really useful evidence to say this is what students have said about your lecture. You know, we need to go back and change this. And that's been one thing that the school has done as a whole. But I think in terms of the broader movement, students have been massively engaged with that, and they've really appreciated, you know, the emphasis that was the BLM work initially and the fair work. They've been very, very active in engaging with all the concepts and ideas, and really developing a critical perspective on their curriculum a lot more. And I think they're finding that there is a much safer space available for them to raise those concerns and have them to an extent acted upon, I think. So it's definitely galvanized something among the student body as well, to have that critical focus, and hopefully that transcends into their work and, you know, the approaches that they take forward as well. So, but yeah, Emilie
the students have always been the most like engaged on this topic, and when like, so with the toolkit being created for them, it's going to be sent basically to every new student before they arrive at the school. It's kind of a contract of like, this is what you need to come up with. But we have been doing discussions in, we're doing LSHM Welcome Week. So every year the student arrive, they have 1 week when they're supposed to discover every group at the school. And so we did our first presentation last year. And one of the students said, I feel safer knowing that you exist. So that was, yeah, like, it was beautiful. And like a lot of students, like we had like, how many people came? 300, like 200 or something like that. The students, it was one of the most attended like intro, and a lot of questions, and really just listening and being like, okay, I think it made them feel like, okay, there's a space for me to talk about those things. And when before they weren't sure. And there's also a place where I can ask questions when I'm not sure, because that's our role. We're not there to just like criticize things. We are very open to the fact that sometimes people don't understand the situation. They don't understand if it might have been racist or not. They're not sure. And so you're a place for them to come and ask questions. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. And so, but yeah, the student body, I think, it's been the most positively, I say, impacted by this work, and we hope it continues.
Yeah, I was just going to add, though, in terms of the wider institution, in your more formal evaluation, there is less in terms of saying what is expected of a module organiser or a member of staff in terms of teaching. So we don't you know, you're just kind of asked to do it. So there isn't really any assessment to say, okay, what steps have you done on your module, and how has this worked? The only thing we really have is this student feedback. So I think there is certainly space or room at the school, you know, to take, you know, to have some more formal evaluation of the work that's taking place, I guess, and say these are the things that module organisers, staff have done, you know, and how useful and effective have they been? So yeah.
I think one other thing is also because what Ruth was talking about, what she has been doing in PSR, what's been done in sexual health, it's the initiative of the module organizer. They don't get extra support, extra funding to do that. There have been now created some new funding mechanism at the school for initiatives around EDI and anti-racism. But like she said, there is now that line in the evaluation, but there is no clear guidelines on, even like there's also other toolkit to help module organizers thinking about the use of imagery and the curriculum and the examples, but it is still not a requirement. And also at the school, our teaching structure is very unique because we're researcher first. Teaching is just part of our work. We're not being directly paid to teach, like kind of, but it's a bit blurry. And it's just part of our work. So we are evaluated more on it's like 20% or 30%. So we are evaluated on our work and our deliverable to our donors and like the grant that we're working on. And the teaching is something we do on top of it, but there's not as, like, yeah. If someone decides not to do anything, the feedback would be there. I don't know who is looking at this feedback. Is there moments where someone sees the feedback and say, oh, this is really bad, I should be talking to that person? It's not very clear. And also the person who oversees the teaching, which is the top program director, does not have a hierarchical relationship with the module organizer. It's functional. So, and it can be tricky sometimes because like you can have a top program director who's working on the same grant with one of the module organizer, or like there's a lot of just mismatch in terms of like relationship that make this quite complex. And in universities where you are either lecturer or a grant or like doing the research, it would be completely different. But yeah, that's not the structure that we have. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Emilie. We've got one quick question from colleagues who are present, and then we will close.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we could access the student toolkit that they've created.
Yeah, it's yeah, we made sure that it's open source. So anyone can download it, use it. We just made sure that it would be accessible to anyone really. And I think Dr. Itumeleng put it in the chat as well. But yeah, you can download it from anywhere.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much to the FAIR team, Emilie, Ember, Ruth. This has been phenomenal. I think the you know, it has opened up a lot of discussion certainly from our side, and given us ideas as well as to, you know, what can be infused in our own teaching and learning practices. And if there are any further questions, you may direct them through to me, to the audience, and then I'll pass them on to the team. There is a short evaluation. If you are able to just spend 1 or 2 minutes on that evaluation, give the FAIR team your comments. They're very happy to get your ideas and what else you would like them to perhaps consider. And also the Transformation Committee itself would appreciate your ideas on future talks that you would like as well. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. And many thanks again to the FAIR team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice to meet
Bye.
you. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Bye.